All right. I think we are live. Good morning, Facebook, and good morning, YouTube. This is Rachel Marshall with the Money Advantage podcast. We have a great conversation planned for you today on how to pay off student loan debt. And I have a special guest with me today to talk about doing just that. And we're going to talk about this in alignment with making sure that you're in an abundance frame of mind and really able to maximize your wealth creation goals. So, I'll be right back with you in just a moment. All right. Good morning and welcome back to the Money Advantage podcast. I'm Rachel Marshall, and I don't have Bruce Wayner with me today. He is traveling, but I do have a special guest, and that is Stephanie Bousley. I should have made sure I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Good job.
Excellent. So, welcome, Stephanie, to the show.
Thank you for having me, Rachel.
Excellent. Well, we are talking today about paying off student loans, and many people think of this as debt. And there's a lot of guilt and a lot of shame and a lot of limitations and limiting beliefs that come along with that in a lot of ways. And Stephanie has really unpacked this for herself. She has not only recovered from $289,000 of student loan debt, she is a story of millennial debtor to success. And we want to be able to share her story with you. And she also has a book where she's written all about this in Buy the Avocado Toast. And that's making more money, living or crushing, a guide to crushing student loan debt, making more money, and living your best life. So, welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Excellent. Well, I am really excited to share your story with our audience today. And specifically, if you are listening to the show and you're thinking, I have this student loan debt, maybe it's been something that I either am about to graduate and I'm going to have student loan debt as I'm going into my life, or maybe you're thinking, this is still something that I'm dealing with and I'm 10 years or 12 years or 20 years out of school and I'm still working on paying this down. I think this conversation is going to be for you no matter where you fall in that spectrum. So today, if you want to pay off student loan debt, build faith in yourself and be in a position of crushing that feeling of failure and guilt that comes along with it, this is the conversation for you. So Stephanie, let's go ahead and jump into your story. Tell us what brought this whole thing about for you in terms of where we are today. You wrote this book, but let's back up. You went to school. Bring us on that story with us.
Yeah. So I finished graduate school and got my master's in 2012 from NYU, which is New York University. And it was still we were coming off the recession at that time, and there were very few film jobs, which is what I had studied. Um, so I had like over $200,000 in student debt, and I had started to read books about, getting out of debt and personal finance. And pretty much every book I read just made me feel like I was like a dumb, bad person
Mm,
who had made horrible life choices. It kind of always, I felt like tonally, all of the books treated me like I was just an overspender. Like, and if I only stopped spending money on anything that's not an absolute necessity, like don't stop going to Starbucks, stop, taking taxis, whatever, that I could someday get out of debt. But none of that stuff resonated with me because I had so much debt and such a low by comparison income that I
mm,
would have had to live that way for like 20 years before the debt was paid off. And I was 30 when I graduated.
mm,
So it just didn't seem like anything I read really took into account my situation, like that I wasn't just like someone who got into trouble shopping with credit cards or something like that. I actually always thought I would be a successful person. I went to the best schools. I tried to find something that I really loved as a career, because I was always told this narrative of follow your dreams and all of that. So um, I decided to, ultimately, what happened is I changed careers and I wrote my book to help people deal with my amount and type of debt while I was paying off my own. And one of the many things that this involved was I actually worked abroad for a number of years to get a lower tax rate than I would have gotten by staying in New York or Los Angeles. And
Ah,
that was a
that's
big
super
part of
interesting.
my strategy, which I think we'll get into a little later.
Yes, well, I love you just pull a lot of threads together that I want to highlight for a minute. And one is that there can be this perspective in our culture that all debt is the same and that all debt is bad. And I'm actually going to even correct something that we all think about. We all think if I have a liability, if I have a loan of any kind, if I have a mortgage or a student loans, or I have credit cards, we think of all of that as debt. And the real truth
Right.
is it's not even necessarily debt. Now, in a case of a student loan, yes, it is, because you don't have an asset on the other side of that. But the
Right.
true definition of debt is an asset minus liability. And what is that equation? If that's a positive number, you're in a position of equity or ownership, or you are in positive net worth. That's not even debt. But if you have negative net worth, now you're actually in debt. And so I think so many times people say, I have a loan, I have to do everything possible to just pay off that loan. And all of my life force and attention and financial means, all is funneled into this one thing that's not even the big picture. And I think it can really sidetrack and distract so many people. And again, as you're saying, layer on that guilt and that shame, which is all the opposite of what you need to create the wealth that causes you to really live wealthy. So I love your story. So let's then lead into, so you went to Singapore. Tell us about that. How did you decide Singapore, and was it specifically for the tax rate, or were you looking for something else? How did Singapore come into the equation?
Yeah, so the truth is, if I'm being really honest, it was kind of accidentally. But basically, like, no one really, everyone kind of thinks student debt is part of life, part of being in your 20s. You go to school, this is like what everyone is doing, but no one actually prepares you for when you see that bill with like six figures and it's your name on it. And, so it actually, what no one ever told me, which I wish they would have, was that actually having this debt made it much harder for me to work in film or whatever because I couldn't take really low or no budget jobs. I did intern a few times, but eventually I had to make some money. So it actually, that student debt made it harder for me to pursue my career goals. And that even felt like a bait and switch because I just thought I had followed all the advice that like I had heard and that we had always talked about. So I didn't understand why I was in such a horrible amount of debt when I
Mm.
thought I was just following like the normal stuff everyone had to do. Um, and this is not to say like I'm a victim. I do believe I was a victim of predatory lending, but just in general, getting into the debt, I do take full responsibility for that.
Well, and that's
Um,
key, even. I mean, not to interrupt you, but I think just the idea of taking ownership and responsibility. Hey, these are the decisions I made. Here's the financial position I'm now in. But it is frustrating when you're saying, well, hey, I did this so that I can get this career and work in this field. And now you're saying, well, actually, to work in that field is not going to help me repay this loan that I have taken for that purpose. That's really complicated and frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, and it's kind of like feels obvious to me now, which only more fed my shame and like I should have known better.
Mm.
But I was only 25 when I was making the decision to go to grad school. And I had actually finished undergrad with only a small amount of debt because I had funded it on like scholarships and working. And I kind of thought that grad school might be able to be similar, but it just turned out graduate school was much more demanding and there really wasn't any time to take on other jobs the way that I had done in undergrad.
Mm.
So, anyways, the Singapore thing kind of came up by accident. I had graduated from NYU as a producer, and I produced several students' films that were shooting abroad in Asia. And
Oh,
so I became like the sort of Asia shooting producer of my class.
nice.
And while I was in Singapore, Singapore would be like the home base, right? Because it's a much higher, safer, better functioning country than a lot of other Southeast Asian ones. And while I was doing that, I met some other American expats who needed like a nanny. So it started out, I was just kind of doing some nanny work for this like very high net worth family while I was also finishing my projects to get my degree. And so when that wrapped up, I actually came back to New York, tried to find a job in New York. And when there was really nothing that I could kind of like make a living on, I actually went back to Singapore to work for that family some more. And I ended up kind of in that process and doing my taxes, while I was living there, realized that I was getting like a much lower tax rate than in the US, and that there's a lot of jobs where just by doing your same job in a different country, even if you make under 100,000, you still might be able to save like 20,000, 30,000 extra in tax if you're in a country with a low rate. So once I kind of
That is
figured
so
that out,
interesting.
the first year that I realized like, oh, okay, wow, like I actually don't owe US tax because I was under the threshold.
Oh,
Um,
because I was going to say, I thought if you're a US citizen, usually if you're living abroad, you still pay taxes in the US plus that other country, usually, right?
yeah, usually, yeah,
Unless
but
you're under a threshold.
yeah, so if you're under 107,000, it's a pretty big threshold actually.
Oh,
So $107,000 for 2020, you do not have to pay US tax on that amount. So like if
oh,
you're
okay.
making $150,000 a year, you're basically taxed at the rate of someone who makes $43,000 a year,
Oh,
which is much
okay.
lower,
Mm-hmm.
because that first 107 basically doesn't count.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
and so then I thought, well, I didn't actually really like living in Singapore initially. And I really thought it was kind of felt like a punishment that I was like this weird Asian country with like watching my friends like go to Sundance and stuff. And that was a real period of like
Mm.
feeling I'm sorry to say that I messed up my life. And
Uh-huh.
so but I was just like so uncomfortable and felt so ashamed of the amount of like
Mm.
students that I was in. I just said, you know what, I'm gonna just put my head down and work for a few years and do this. And um, financially, that ended up being like a really good decision.
That's really interesting. So, I mean, there's so many lessons that you could pull from that. One, maybe before going into school, what advice would you give to somebody who is saying, okay, here's probably the cost of school, here's probably what the career path and the financial income that you might get out of that. How do you think about that differently now in terms of an investment that you want to earn a return from
Right,
when you're
right.
going into school?
Yeah, I mean, so I ended up researching this for my book, and it was really funny because all the things I learned of like what not to do were basically the things I had done, like go to art
We
school,
all learn
go to
in
graduate.
retrospect.
Yeah. So, so yeah, I felt, whatever bad about that. But anyhow, remind me what you specifically asked.
Oh,
I'm
so
so sorry.
what advice would you give to somebody who
Oh,
is
oh yeah.
looking at going into school and thinking about that as an investment that you want to
Yeah,
return
yeah.
from in the career field?
So, if I'm really being honest with myself, when I look back, I thought that I was just following my dreams. And I thought that as Americans, this is kind of what we tell young people to do.
Mm,
Um, but a lot of the time, I wasn't taking into account how I actually had a lot of external validation attached to those goals. So, like, I thought, oh, it'll be enough if I'm just like a filmmaker and if I'm at a party, I can say, I worked on some documentary, whatever. But once I had the debt, I felt like I had to prove something that I had
mm,
gotten something by going into this debt. So my goals became much more concerned with like, I have to, make something successful right away. I put all this pressure on myself that ultimately just made me really unhappy because like anything, it takes years to like learn how to get good at something.
mm-hmm.
And so yeah, I wish I could tell young people that like um you shouldn't just pick anything and go to the best school. That might have been applicable years ago, but tuition has increased by 1,400% since 1940. So, and the salaries have not increased at that rate. In fact, a lot of industries have declined. So, for people who are really interested in being like journalists or musicians or artists, I try to say that, you have to really go back and think about, do I want to be trying to pay off this debt while I'm also trying to pursue that career? Because if that career only exists in like a big city, it might actually be easier to go intern before I have the debt. And so I don't have that extra burden of like trying to make that overhead every month.
Mm.
And no one could have, I mean, people could have said this to me at the time when I was making the decision, and I'm sure I would not have listened. So I totally get why if kids are like, no, I just want to do this
Well,
thing.
it's so
Um,
interesting because we all learn through experience, and yet we would like to shortcut the terrible decisions we make for other people. And I think it takes a unique person to be able to say, okay, look, I'm teachable now. And maybe that means that they had to have failed in a smaller capacity first. But I think that ability to be teachable and be open to learning and open to thinking differently is so critical of a mindset shift for anyone to become any kind of success in anything they do. And it's just really interesting that you look at the successful people have a different mindset usually than the people who are not successful and who have not achieved the goals.
yeah. And, one part of financial self sabotage, which is kind of the ongoing theme of my book, is like reducing financial self sabotage. Um, one version of that, we always think about it like overspending or compulsive shopping or something like that. But really, one version of financial self sabotage is like convincing yourself that what you have is like the way it has to be. And I used to tell people all the time, you don't understand the industry. This is what everyone has to do. Everyone has to work for free for like a year or
Mm.
two to even get a paid job. And when I started to be around wealthy people in Singapore, which my job put me in the center of, I just realized that other people didn't think this way. Like successful people were just much better at, advocating for themselves, asking for what they really wanted, and um, kind of more unapologetic about like what their needs are or how they want to spend their paycheck or whatever. And
Mm.
so that was a big learning for me because I had always had kind of a chip on my shoulder about rich people. And I realized how that really wasn't serving me at all because once I lost that, I got a lot of much smarter friends than me at the investment firm. They can help me look over investments today, even. I can ask them for advice. If I am out of work, I can ask people, do they need any remote work? Like all of my accepting of this world and like being part of it just really helped me in the end. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I was still kind of like judging wealthy people or putting myself in a separate category or what have you.
I love that you share that. And I know we talked earlier as well before we brought you on the show. And it's just interesting, again, to see the difference in perspective between people who are successful and the majority or the status quo. And I don't say that to belittle anyone in their current level of thinking, but what is required that I have realized that we talk about on the show on a regular basis is that if you want to have a certain level of achievement in your life, the only way to do that is to look at what other people who have achieved that are doing and surround yourself with that and change your mindset and up level and really think differently and expand your thinking, because the level of thinking that we stay at if we're thinking and playing small is not abundance minded. It's very constrictive. It's guilt, it's shame, it's all the
Yeah.
fear, it's all the I can't have this or I can't have that. I mean, the same scarcity mindset causes somebody to hoard all of their money and never spend anything, and because they're afraid of not having enough money, but the same scarcity mindset also causes somebody to spend lavishly and spend everything they have and never save anything because they're afraid of missing out. And so either way, that's driven in fear, whereas the abundance mindset is this: how do I steward my resources, which is not just my financial wealth, this is my mental capital. How do I steward the intelligence that I've been given? How do I steward my gifts and my skills? And how do I best serve the world? How do I create the most value? And that's exactly what you were working to do. So let's fast forward now. How did you pay off your student loan debt? How long did it take? Just take us through that story. And then you're talking about the book all throughout, but you have these practical tips and guidance that people probably may be aware of, and maybe it's on the fringes of the periphery of their concept in terms of how can you pay off student loans without getting stuck in that scarcity mindset.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's really the whole point here is, I started to see that, I think, as I spent more time around people with money, like they worked very hard, they're very smart, they're very unapologetic. Whereas I was like, would feel guilty for getting my paycheck on some weird level, like even though it was my paycheck that I earned. So, I ended up kind of taking a multi approach. But the first thing was I tried to look at my goals and take out the external validation part of those goals. And this is something I find so interesting. I even had this conversation with my publicist where we were talking about like Instagram growth. And I was like, why don't we have more numbers? And she's like, well, these are the quality like followers I'm targeting. And she's like, do you want to just look popular, or do you actually want to have like people that are into the same thing you're talking about? And I had to stop myself and be like, yeah, like which do I want? I just want to look like I'm some whatever on Instagram. And like, why is I think that there is some value in that, could lead to opening other doors or whatever. But it's like, I need to constantly remind myself to shift my focus away and question really when I want to spend money on something, like, what am I after there? Am I trying to impress other people, make people like me? And I found that once I took out the external validation, my goals were a lot more flexible and felt like achievable to me, because I really just, at the end of the day, I don't really, I realize I don't care if I work in film. I just really want to be around smart people who value me and pay me what I think I'm worth. And that was important to me, where I couldn't have seen that if I was just focused myopically on, this goal of making films or what have you.
That's so key. And I want to interrupt you and just stop right there for a second, because
Yeah.
I think so many times we don't evaluate why. And that's what you're saying. You're saying, really look at what is your why behind even what you're working for and what you're working to achieve. And it's possible that your why should be much grander and bigger than it even is now. And it's possible that your why is completely different than what you thought it was. And it is very interesting. You're talking about taking out that external validation. That takes some deep internal work. I mean, that takes some self-awareness and some really thinking through and wrestling over who you really are and how can you truly be fulfilled. So if you're listening to this, I think this is just a crucial perspective shift to really step back and say, how do I figure out what I actually want? Not what I think someone else expects of me. And I think maybe different cultural things play into that, and maybe different personality styles, or you could say there's so many different things. I mean, if you talk about Enneagram, or you talk about any one of the different ways of thinking and contextualizing personality, I think some people are more driven to have an outward display of success in some way. But what does that mean internally? And I think that's really what you're after.
Yeah. And am I paying money to just like get followers, or am I paying to find people that I can help with my book and my message? It really is the question. And
Mm-hmm.
if I go back to like, why did I even embark on this ever? Because I'm not like a professional, uh, writer, book author, something like that. Like I still have a day job, which is important for me to point out because I am just like anyone who has a job and who's trying to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I even wrote a book, it was a huge step for me to just be able to say out loud, like I once had this amount of debt because I hid it from it. I didn't tell anyone the number ever, not my partner, not my parents. Like, I
Mm.
just couldn't even bring myself to say, like, I have this much debt. Um, and so, another thing that was really key in my approach that I also outline in my book is really hunting out compulsive and impulsive behavior because so much of the mistakes people we make with money has to do with um, sometimes it's tied to like addictive or compulsive behavior. And people say, oh, just stop doing that. Just don't spend money on alcohol anymore. Right. But if a person feels like that's really helping them cope with their emotions and their life, you can't really just tell someone to stop doing that. They might need some help. So in my book, I try to give people a lot of resources for like whatever it is that you feel may contribute to your compulsive money choices, like whether it's smoking, drinking, you know, depression, gifting compulsively, um, anxiety that makes you like you just buy something instead of looking for the cheapest one or the best deal or something.
Mm.
Anything like that, really, we have to be willing to look at those things because it's really hard to be like, I'm going to pay off all this debt while I still drink $40 of alcohol every single day or something.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
just be like, but I want to figure out how to get out of debt without addressing that. Well, actually, addressing that would be a really impactful step on like getting some money back from your paycheck every month. And
Absolutely.
it feels so hard to, we all have our vices like our snacks, our food, our Netflix watching, or whatever it is. But when those things are checking like the box of like small expenses adding up, it is something that it's like it would make my life a lot easier if I just looked at what I thought was the hardest thing instead of fighting to keep that one thing by eliminating everything else.
It's just really interesting that you're talking about leaning into something difficult, which is hard to do. You're thinking now. We have to remember to come into this conversation at all. You have to realize, I have a goal, and that goal is important to me, and it's so important to me that I am willing to deal with my external validation, and I'm willing to deal with obsessive behaviors or addictive behaviors, and I'm willing to do the hard work of looking at where I'm spending money. And this is something that I'm not sure you're familiar with or not, but we don't advocate budgeting. We talk about having a spending plan and being aware of your cash flow. And a lot of times people will say, well, I'm not making enough money to save,
Yes.
when really that just means we've become accustomed to a certain lifestyle, and we expect that that's something that we ought to continue for whatever reason. Our friends expect it, our kids expect it, our spouse expects it, we expect it of ourselves, and we have to keep this going. And so a lot of times you can look at and address those things and really shore up your spending in areas that are not aligned with your value system. And I say that really strategically because if going out for coffee with a certain group of friends is really important to you, then that's not an expense you should cut. If
Right.
if buying avocado toast and or eating healthy or eating organically or going to the gym is a core value of yours, then you shouldn't be cutting those things that are aligned with your values. The problem is, I think a lot of times we do spend in ways that's not aligned with our value system. There's also, we talk about looking at your taxes and strategically addressing that, and looking at the way that you're paying off debt and making sure you're not barreling all of your money into something that's not serving you well, and really being in a position of looking at all of the other factors outside of your lifestyle expenses that often are money leaks that are draining
Mm-hmm.
money out of your pocket. But at the same time, you're saying, hey, let's actually look at your lifestyle. Is your lifestyle congruent with what you want to be achieving in life?
Yeah, because if you're not doing that, you're just kind of applying the same black and white advice that we tell people also with like weight loss, right? And we say, oh, just calories out, calories in, money out, money in. It's very easy. Just have more than you spend, or, you know, but obviously if that was so easy, everyone would be like up to speed with their retirement savings, not in a debt, you know, skinny, whatever. And so
Right.
I think the fact that like obviously more things are driving our behavior, it's a little more complex other than a lack of understanding of math or something.
Right. Well,
You
and I
know,
think a piece of that is that it's so emotional. Everything that we do, we would like to think that we're very logical and systematic and disciplined in the way that we spend money. And yet it's been proven that it's primarily an emotionally driven decision. We'll justify it later logically, but at the same time, it's an emotional decision. And so there's so many things that what you're talking about is how do I address that emotional side of everything that's happening with my money so that I can make wise choices. And
yeah,
I love that you're talking about
because
that.
the anxiety of like not being able to do your credit card bill, pay it off in full that month, is almost like in a way worse than whatever discomfort you might have had to go through to like
Oh,
make
sure.
that extra budget or whatever. And another thing I always tell people if they're like, what's something easy I can just do, you know, right away? Um, I ask them like, how is your non-monthly budgeting, right? So we
Good.
always have tell people about a monthly budget, but a lot of people, I'm even guilty of this, don't put things that I do every 3 4 months or once a year. So
Mm-hmm.
for example,
Christmas.
yeah, like Christmas, or just I know if I get my hair cut and colored, I don't, by the way, but if I did and I know that that's $300 every 3 months, it shouldn't just be like that month hits and I spend the money and I'm taking it out of my emergency fund because like whoops, it wasn't in the monthly budget. You
Right.
have to just like average out, spend a couple of minutes averaging out those less frequent expenses and making sure you're just pulling that as a monthly cost and putting it to the side so that when it does come up, you don't have to go through this like guilt spiral of taking out of my emergency fund, which to me sends me through a whole emotional drama of like, oh, I'm doing this again, why am I doing this,
Right.
and I just can save myself all of that if I just say, look, yeah, you know, every summer you like to buy a new swimsuit. So you better have, $100 in May and set aside, a couple of dollars each
Right.
month just so you can do that. So when it comes up, you don't have to beat yourself up for going into your emergency fund or not paying your bill in full.
I love several things. One, you're talking about planning long range. Secondly, you're talking about an emergency fund. So I will share our perspective with emergency fund because as we believe you should be paying yourself first
Yes.
up to at least 30% of your income. Now, granted, some people who are not saving at all, 2% of your income is a good first step, but you should be working towards 30% or more of your income. And then you're building that into an emergency fund for true emergencies, things like unforeseen medical expenses or
Yeah, or COVID.
right. Right. I mean, not that that's a laughing matter, but nobody could have predicted that. I mean, that's not something
Yeah.
that you plan for a pandemic every year to come around or something.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
but that's a true emergency. Whereas what you're talking about is a planned spending item. I mean, for instance, we will advocate saying if it's Christmas, then yes, take your monthly amount and plan for that each month in your planning tracking system. Maybe that's mint.com. Maybe you're using YNAB. You need a budget. Maybe you're just doing it pen and paper, but somehow you're thinking of how am I allocating in my monthly spending for these large ticket items? And honestly, you should even be accounting for things like renewal tags on your car and service and
Exactly.
maintenance. I mean, that's not an emergency if you know that you're going to end up at some point
Yeah.
replacing tires.
Right. And I mean, it's not to say, oh, we have to like overly worry and think of every possible thing that could go wrong. But it's kind of like just getting a little more honest with yourself. Like, I know I probably will buy Christmas gifts. I do it every year. This year probably won't be an exception.
Right.
versus like, oh, maybe I'll just decide to like not get a pedicure next month. Maybe, but
Right.
like, has that, when was the last time that happened?
Right.
Let's not pretend that these things are just coming up out of need or whatever when they actually really aren't.
Mm-hmm. So let's bring it back to your story for a second. This is really, really beneficial and valuable. So $289,000 of student loan debt. So how long did that take you to cover and pay that off?
Yeah. So to be totally honest with you, it's not completely paid off. I've paid off about $150,000 of debt, and
That's still a
I've
lot. In how much time frame?
in I guess it would be a span of 8 years. Um,
That's a lot.
so so that was and part of that strategy was kind of things I already mentioned, like working abroad, and
Mm-hmm.
just putting that money I saved on US tax back into the loans. Um, I did a lot of work to fix my credit. That was a
Oh,
huge
this is
part of the
good.
story as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I think, I just spoke at a conference. I didn't really get into the importance of credit because I was like, oh, it's kind of a boring downer topic for
Oh, it is
people.
boring,
But
but
like,
most of the fundamentals of finance are very boring. And I think sometimes we're like, let's get on to the exciting things. And the problem is the exciting, flashy things are not what systematically set you up for systematic success. So
yeah,
go ahead and you
exactly.
can
So
touch on this as much as you want. Yeah.
yeah, so like when I was really first facing the debt, my credit score was probably in the 500 or 600s, because when I moved abroad, like I had some bills that didn't get paid and they were bad items. And, it was just kind of messy because I hadn't been paying close enough attention.
Mm.
And,
Which is common for anybody.
yeah. So I was I was, at the time, my loans were getting 8.5% interest per month. So it was quite a lot. I think they were earning something like $1,500 in just interest every month. So if I paid $1,500 towards the debt, that would only cover the amount of interest that the debt gained for that month and not pay
Wow.
off anymore. And this
So
was like
do you know your
destroyed
total?
me.
I can imagine just because, okay, so 1,500 a month. I mean, you have to think about the volume of the liability itself, the loan, the 289,000. I want to make sure I'm saying that number correctly. And then 8.5% interest. That is huge.
Yeah.
1,500 a month. I mean, that's a giant payment for
So
anybody.
every month, like I was under the income-based repayment. I didn't have to pay the 1,500 a month. I only had to pay 10% of my income, but that meant that the loan was still growing faster than it was reducing, and that was like just killing me every month because I'm like, I'm in a suicide mission here. Like I'm actually not ever going to get out of the debt unless I can change something about how this machine
Which
is
I
working.
think that's really important for somebody to realize and process through as well. Just because there is an availability of making a smaller payment doesn't mean it's the right decision for you. And you want to think about the big picture. So that's really important that you
Yeah.
mentioned that the loan was still growing.
And I have talked to this guy, Travis Horney, on Student Loan Planner. He has a really great strategy if people have government debt, which is he gets people to like pay off the minimum of the government debt, but then put the rest in a savings so that the interest that you get from that will pay off your big tax bill later when the debt gets written off completely. So that is one strategy also. I didn't really go for that because my debt was just snowballing at such a high rate every month. So I really focused on refinancing to get that interest number down so that I could at least say every month I was paying off a little bit of the actual debt, not just
Mm-hmm.
that month's interest. So,
Well, and I like what
yes,
you mentioned as well about the possible other strategy of paying the minimum. Now, if you're in a position where, I mean, there's so many elements of this that I'll pull together at the end, but you're mentioning
yeah,
refinancing for a lower rate, which is a key part so that you're minimizing the overall amount of interest that you're paying, but it also means that the dollars that you do pay towards the loan are moving you forward instead of backwards.
right. Which I know is kind of also something that you guys advocate for when you're
Yes.
looking at like HELOC credit versus your product and stuff. So yeah, I think that is,
and I'll bring that up in just a second, but I want to stick with your story for a second.
Yeah. So I basically hired this lawyer on like Upwork or something, and asked him. He was like a retired tax lawyer, and I was like, "Can you please help? I don't know anything about improving credit. Can I pay you a couple $100 and you fix this, or see if you can fix this situation?" And so during that process, I learned all about how, you first look at the reporting agencies. Is that information correct? Then you look at like the debt you actually already owe, and the time frame. And, so he helped me look at all these different things. And I have a chapter in my book where I kind of like explain that process to people. And I have like drafts of the letters we sent that people can just kind of copy and, put in their own information.
Excellent. Like a template.
Yeah, like templates. So that was a big thing. And for my first 9 months of trying to refinance, it was just rejection. My seller was not high enough. My debt was way too high. Nobody even wanted to touch it. It made me feel just like a worthless person. Like nobody wanted to even take a chance, like borrowing money to me. And it was so easy to get wrapped up in that and be like, I should just give up. Like, this is pointless. I'm just going to have this debt. But I didn't, I kept, if I would get a raise, or if, 4 or 6 months would pass, I would just try to reapply again to see if maybe this time, I had a little bit lower debt to income ratio. So maybe, they could do something. And eventually, I did. I think I first got it refinanced from like 8.5 to like 6.5. And I just continued every couple 6 months or year. When I would get a raise, or when a little more of the debt was paid off, I would try to get a better rate. And now my rate is like 3.5 or something, because my credit's pretty much perfect, at this point. And
that's excellent.
I've paid a lot of the debt off. Yeah. And so basically, by just detaching my sense of like self-worth away from like these rejections of wanting to lend me the refinancing money, I was able to keep going and actually eventually get much lower rates. So I'm not hemorrhaging interest like I was at the time.
Right.
And that was a huge part of getting the debt reduced, because otherwise I would have just been paying only interest forever.
I love that you mentioned that, because again, any loan payoff, whether it's for student loans or whether it's for poor purchases that you've made in the past, or whether it's from you lost your job and you had to keep on your life expenses and putting food on the table, and so you went and dipped into credit cards, whatever the reason, there is a strategic way that will work for you. There's not one best way. There's not one blanket answer. It's not all debt is bad, pay it off all as fast as possible. It's not don't ever pay off your loans.
Yeah.
It's not only pay off the high interest ones first. And I think the problem is a lot of times people can use these blanket strategies to conquer liabilities that don't work for everyone. I mean, that's kind of where we started the conversation today.
Yeah.
And I just want to mention, so we talk about something called the cash flow index, where you take the balance of the loan, divide by the minimum monthly payment. And I was actually going to ask you if you remember when your interest was at 8.5% and the interest payment itself was $1,500. Do you remember what the total payment that on the loan is that you could have made at that time? Do you remember?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was only like maybe 1,700 or even like 1,678 or something like that.
1,678. Okay.
It was so primarily just that much interest.
So I was going to calculate that here. So 289,000, if we say 289,000, oops, I've got too many zeros. 289,000 divided by, you said 1,678. So that leads me, yeah. Okay. I want to make sure I did that right, because that was a very high number. 289,000 divided by 1,678. Yeah. 172. Is the number I come up with. So the way the cash flow index works is that basically you want to think about or conceptualize, and this might be a brand new topic for somebody who's listening, so I just want to outline it very briefly, but it's thinking differently about different liabilities based on how much of your monthly cash is going to pay that minimum payment each month. So how much pain it feels like, how much hemorrhage that is for that particular liability compared to the balance. And when you really think about the big picture, it's basically meaning if you had two loans, they're both $1,000, but one requires a $2 a month payment and one requires $400 a month payment, the one that pays that's requiring $400 a month to go towards that payment is going to hurt you more on a monthly basis. And you want to fix that one first. So if you had the $1,000, you would want to pay that loan off first before the one that only costs you $2 a month. That's the premise behind it.
Yeah.
Now, granted, there's going to be other factors. What's the interest rate? There's just a lot of other, is it a credit card that's going to go from 0% to having a interest rate in a certain number of months? There's a lot to think about with this, but generally the cash flow index would say if your score, the balance divided by the minimum monthly payment, if you get between 0 and 50, then generally that's going to be in your danger zone. Those are the ones that you want to pay off as fast as possible or chunk as much cash towards. If you're between 50 and 100, that's usually there's a warning zone. You want to think about how can I restructure these? And then if the number is over 100, so this is usually going to be your student loans, going to be your mortgages. In the most grand scheme of things, those are the ones that it would take a really long time to pay off the full balance, and it's not going to improve your financial situation as much. However, when you were saying $1,500 a month is going just towards interest, you're saying, let's deal with this so that you're not having that much go towards interest. So according to the cash flow index score, that's 172. That would have placed that liability, actually, it would have placed it in the freedom zone, which would have meant that if you had $289,000 just happening to be lying around and you wanted to pay off a full liability, you probably would have had other liabilities that had a bigger payment that would have taken more priority, and the student loan could have stayed on your balance sheet, and you could have kept that loan or refinanced it. So what we're saying in this whole situation is that maybe for you, if you're listening, your student loans are a high priority to pay off, and maybe they're not. Sometimes a student loan might have such a low payment compared to the balance that it's not really that big of a priority to pay it off as quickly as possible, and your cash could be put to better use. Whereas maybe you're refinancing, you're restructuring that payment, now you have a lower payment, and now the difference that you were paying, now you can put that into a place for savings. The only thing you want to conceptualize is we can eliminate interest, which is removing the interest payment, but what's the opportunity cost of that? What am I giving up in order to put my cash there? And so if I could have earned more interest by putting my money to work and had more peace of mind by having that emergency fund, opportunity fund, as you had mentioned earlier, where's the best use of my cash? And so it's not a blanket strategy. It's not something that you can just do the same thing for every person.
Yeah. And I feel that there was unfortunately kind of a series of personal finance writers that I think came up at the time that most people's debt was credit card debt. So yeah, right. If you have like 26% interest on a credit card bill that you can't refinance, like obviously that's a hemorrhage, and you should be aggressively trying to either reduce the interest or pay it off or whatever. But I think people, once you throw like student loans into the mix, it becomes a way more complex issue with different options and different, approaches to dealing with it. And unfortunately, I think that people just get confused by how, complicated or intimidated that they don't understand money or investing enough to really do this. But, it's really much simpler than people think. And even the process of like buying a house when you have debt is something that a lot of people I had 2 properties actually at one point. And I just sold my Los Angeles one that I only stayed in for 3 years. But I made like almost $60,000 profit on that. But
nice.
People will think like, oh, I'm out of the running. They take themselves out of the running, of like, oh, that's just, I don't have enough money to like think about that stuff, or my financial situation isn't so complicated that I need, these tools or what have you. And I just tell people like, look, start somewhere. Don't be afraid of what you don't know, but just even trying to read a book that's based on you know, like my book is helping regular people understand these things. And it's like, just try giving yourself the ammunition to like start thinking in a different way. Don't worry about what you don't know or what you don't understand. There's a lot of things about finance I don't understand, but that doesn't mean I can't learn some of the easier things to like really improve my day-to-day life in the meantime.
That's excellent. And I think we all have to start with where we're at and maximize and exercise the best stewardship of our resources and keep learning. And that means that no matter who you are, inadvertently, you're going to get 5 years down the road and you're going to say, I wish I had done things differently. And at the same time, you've made progress based on the best you knew at the time. And so that is the number one thing that's going to give you the confidence to continue to make that traction and move forward. So, Stephanie, so if somebody does want to get your book or wants to find out more about you or follow your blog, how do they do that? How do they connect up with you?
Yeah. So my book is available online at the usual places. It's on Amazon, Target, Barnes and Noble's websites. To learn more about me, my website is www.youarenotyourdebt.com. And I do have some blog articles there and links also to buy the book. And you can sign up on my mailing list if you would like updates or times when I'm on shows like yours again. So yeah, they can check it out there. youarenotyourdebt.com.
Excellent. And I know that they can buy your book directly. Well, I think they can buy your book directly from that as well.
Yeah, there's a link there too.
Yes. Okay. I've seen that. I wasn't sure if it just takes you out to the other sources, but that is great. And, you know, if you are listening today and you're thinking, hey, I have a lot of debt, I haven't been sure how to think about this, maybe it's time to get a book like Buy the Avocado Toast. And maybe it's time to really start thinking through what are your options? How can you maximize your income? How can you think differently about this rather than just having to scrimp and save and limit and shrink down in scarcity and think you're going to be in debt forever, rather than having the guilt hanging over your head forever, and rather than just ignoring it or setting it off to the side and being like, this is too challenging, I don't want to have to deal with this. Rather than any of those options, if you proactively take steps to say, how can I maximize my responsibility and my stewardship? How can I use my money to the best of my ability? You're going to be on the right track. So I would encourage you as well, if you're thinking, what position am I going to be the safest in? I know, Stephanie, you mentioned this as well, that being free of debt is not the same thing as being financially free. And I think sometimes we get that confused and we say, oh, well, if I'm just out of debt, that means that I'm finally financially free. But really, we ultimately want to have that financial freedom where you have income from assets that is greater than your expenses. You're in a position where you're thinking about real estate and businesses, and you're thinking about, how do I have those things that are covering my monthly living? And maybe that's not someone's goal, but usually when I'm talking about financial freedom, I'm saying, how can I maximize all of my assets to produce as much cash flow as possible? So I want to as well mention, if you're interested in finding out more about the best place to store cash while you are also paying down loans, while you're also moving forward financially, we have a course called Privatized Banking Secrets, and you can go to privatizedbankingsecrets.com for more information on that. So
I actually checked it out. It's very interesting. So awesome. I just want to give it's a great resource.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And again, this would be more so for the type of strategy of saying, how can I maybe pay that minimum on my loan right now? And how can I put the rest of my cash over into a place where I can store that capital and I can access and I can use it, and it's growing, possibly even at a higher interest rate than the loan that I'm paying, which means then if I can store up this cash and have access to it all along the way, I'm in a position where I now have that emergency and opportunity fund that I can tap into. And oh, by the way, I might even be able to pay off my loan sooner because of the growth on that all at one lump sum. So again, it's thinking differently, thinking, what are my options and what works for me? So sometimes it requires talking with somebody about your strategy and really putting all the pieces together. Sometimes it's just a show like this with ideas that give you that spark of what you can do to move forward.
Yeah. And I mean, people, like, we're not just put on this earth to be like vessels for making money or paying off debt, you know. The person working on like 5 hours of sleep because they have 3 jobs is not the guy who's like coming up with a light bulb moment in the board meeting, right? It's like,
so good.
You know, when you had asked a question, I think, about like, why is it important to understand that debt does not define you? It's like, you don't want to internalize that feeling of like, I'm a person who's bad, worthless, made bad decisions, deserves to punish myself. You just don't want to be that person. So it is very important for these messages about separating yourself from self-esteem and finance intertwinement that is really applicable today.
Absolutely. And I think nothing will kill your productivity and your creativity and your ability to actually produce value in the world faster than having all those negative mindsets that I'm guilty, I'm not worth this, and I'm bad, and all this shame. So really we need to value ourselves, as you were talking about, and be able to work through those mental barriers. So
Yeah.
Stephanie, thank you for sharing your story today. Thank you for being brave
Thank
enough
you
to put
so
out
much.
there that $289,000 of student loan debt. I mean, that's not something that is easy to be vulnerable about. And yet you've chosen to do that. And you're not only liberating yourself, but other people as well. And so I really appreciate you doing that.
Hopefully. Yeah. Thank you so much, Rachel. It was really a pleasure talking to you. Really.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I sincerely appreciate this today. Thank you for sharing your book. If you're listening, go get a copy of Buy the Avocado Toast. And in closing, please remember, success leaves clues. So model the successful few, not the crowd, and build a life and business you love.